Hello and welcome to Public Forum. I'm Amandra Bhatt. Europe is facing the largest migration crisis since World War II as record numbers of people flee violence in Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan as well as conflicts across North Africa. Today in Public Forum we discuss Europe's migrant crisis, what are the pressures faced by different countries in Europe, what are the biggest obstacles to a solution, and given the political climate there, how will the bloc deal with the intake of refugees? And to discuss Europe's migrant crisis, we have with us in the studios an eminent panel. Please welcome Sreeram Chaulia, a Dean at the Jindal School of Global Affairs. Welcome to the program, Professor Chaulia. Professor Chaulia, coming to you now, how important is the terminology around this entire crisis? I'm pointing to, various media reports as well as, the United Nations reports. Should they be referred to as refugees or should we call them migrants? Because how we refer to them also somewhere determines our response to these people.
Yeah, I mean, see, technically the determination of the status of for asylum and to become a refugee has to be done through a process, right? And one must prove that there is either a threat of direct persecution and violence from armed actors, or that they are fleeing a generalized violence, which is like warfare. Now, as Ambassador was mentioning, the bulk of them are coming from war zones, active war zones. So more or less, like majority of them, vast majority are actually eligible for asylum. So it is actually a refugee problem. It's not really a migration problem per se. Sometimes you have mixed populations and you need to separate them. There is, for example, the Germans are worried about so-called asylum seekers who are coming from the Balkans. And the Balkans doesn't have active armed conflicts these days. So it is not also a lot of persecution per se from the Balkans. And they are anyway candidate members to get into the EU. So in those cases you need to separate them. But Syria, Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Libya, Iraq, we are talking about, prima facie, they are facing some form of threat to life, direct political persecution or direct threat to life. So I think it's important to acknowledge that most of these EU member states are signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which mandates all signatories to determine the status and to admit them if they are asylum. The other reason is the EU itself has a so-called Dublin regulation system, right, which is meant to so at the first point of entry they must be processed. But what is happening is what you can call a NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Like, why don't you just push them forward rather than to determine the status, document their presence, give them some papers. So this is what is happening as they go up the trail from Turkey, Greece, then into Hungary and Austria and eventually to Germany. So this is, and on the sea route also, sometimes the sea route is being forgotten because now it is moved, but actually there are a lot still crossing Mediterranean from Libya into Italy. So if you combine these two routes, you're talking about massive problem.
Right. Perhaps this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many more still in those countries that are wanting to come out.
Yeah, but nonetheless, see, even though it's massive, if you think about it, the EU has 28 member countries, and we're talking about around 350,000 only this year. So if they were to set their house in order and have a common, policy towards refugees and migration, maybe they need to update this Dublin regulation, which is not working. And there are questions about the Schengen arrangement because they say that it means that people are able to move freely and take advantage of the borderless European Union. So all these, administrative boundaries that they have structured, and the bureaucracy in Brussels has not been very responsive, has not been creative, has not been able to forge consensus. So everything has fallen on Angela Merkel, and I think she's too cautious. She's waiting for how public opinion is going to shape in Germany.
She's also made a number of pronouncements
that one must credit.
Right.
But nonetheless, she's not been able to create consensus with the rest of the EU member countries, the transit countries that are sending them forward. So there's a huge question about leadership. Also, there is a caricature of the Brussels bureaucracy as a kind of a soulless and a faceless one, which often has technocratic solutions, but doesn't think about larger political issues. So, for example, the EU has a neighbourhood policy. They are supposed to have an outreach towards Syria and towards Iraq and towards Lebanon, Jordan, and try and solve the problem. But they have not been very successful. So it's also
so there seems to be a disconnect between
the foreign policy
Brussels
is also
and
people asking questions about how viable it is. They have an external action service, the EU now. All the member countries have a common foreign service. They have a high representative, Federica Mogherini. But frankly, they have been underachieved in this whole crisis.
Okay. Professor Chaulia, let me continue with you. How do you view the response to this refugee crisis by European Union countries? We've seen a practical response has not been forthcoming from the countries that are most affected by this influx, particularly Britain. Instead, we see these countries trying to focus on, criminal human trafficking rings and so on, and some countries resorting to tightening of their own borders.
Yeah, I think it's a symptom of a larger issue in the EU, which is this revival of narrow nationalism, and especially since the economic crisis began in 2008. You're seeing that they're all scattered. There's no kind of unanimity. Be it on Greece, we saw how badly they were divided. On Russia, on the Ukraine crisis, and now on this migration crisis, it's showing them in a very shambolic form. And the lack of consensus on all these issues actually raises very existential questions, because after the end of the Cold War, the early 90s, it was easy because there was this integration process, more and more members were being admitted, Eastern Europe was being absorbed, there was this whole sense of the triumph of the liberal model and capitalism and all that. So now I think we are in what I call a post-Cold War era, where those consensus have broken down. And what we are seeing in the EU is the a symptom of that, because essentially a country like Hungary has been a problem child for the EU even before this immigration crisis. For example, they have been cracking down on civil liberties, not adhering to the basic standards of democracy. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader, has been privately threatened by other EU member states of expulsion because he's not even meeting the minimum standards. Then there was the Greece issue with fiscal policy and cooking of numbers. So all of this adds up to, I think, it's a big crisis for the EU institutionally. So even as we panelists said that they can absorb the numbers that are coming in right now, institutionally, cohesion, at the end of the day, it is still the greatest experiment in regional integration, the one that has gone the furthest. But you cannot rest on the past laurels. You have to keep on reinventing yourself and rejuvenating yourself as a common market and a single economy and all that. And right now I think they have reached the limits of that process, and they are struggling in that sense.
Right, more so with this crisis, which has been many years in the making. Perhaps they ought to have modified their policies.
Yeah, and look at the irony, the roles have been reversed. Now countries like Greece and Italy are on the same page as Germany on this question.
Right.
Because Germany is saying that all the transit countries have to share the burden, and we have to give quotas and all that, right? And it should not fall upon the recipient countries who are by ill-fated because of geography. They are the closest to North Africa and closest to Turkey, and therefore they are receiving the bulk of them.
And then there is the Dublin regulation that you mentioned.
Yeah. So Germans are, but the problem with it is the Germans also, like the EU bureaucracy, are looking at it as a technical thing. Everyone must follow the rules, and that kind of thing. But the problem is a political one. The anti-immigration politics has risen a lot. So the right-wing, extreme right-wing sentiment is there across the continent. Since the economic crisis began, it's on an upswing. So all of this, now they're going to, for the right on the continent of Europe as well as in the UK, this is the greatest opportunity to say that the peril is coming. It's coming in the form of these Arabs and these Muslims. In fact, there are countries like Poland, which have openly, and Slovakia, I think, which openly said we will not take in Muslim refugees or migrants.
Right. They also said that they haven't participated in the bombing of Libya, so they are not going to share this burden. So all these means that we are now seeing the recrudescence of racism, xenophobia, and in many ways Merkel is like the last refuge for liberal values right now on this question. Okay. And I think she has to assert leadership. She'll need to actually turn around. And I think Germany especially is cognizant of this demographic decline,
And as a leader of the EU, it knows that, yes, it's 500 million plus people, the entire EU, 28 countries, but then it's largely aging. And they need this, influx of refugees or migrants, whether in a forced form like this or through voluntary measures to, replenish their depleting labor force. So for all these reasons, there are sensible voices out there, and they need to be strengthened, and we need to come around to a position where it can create consensus. They have to create incentives and disincentives, I think. Merkel has to lead, and so has the Brussels bureaucracy, saying, if there are countries that are intransigent, then we'll have to give them some inducements or some punishments and to bring them around. This is the real problem. But at the end of the day, we will, all said and done, the criticism, it is still, they have welfare states, they have social democratic setups, especially in the continent. Britain is more like a American-style capitalist model. So the Anglo-Saxon model, the continental model is a magnet, has always been a magnet for refugees and migrants. And maybe to some extent, one has to sympathize with them because of geography. And of course, they have committed major blunders in Libya and have destabilized it and have, brought it upon themselves. But at the same time, they are the refuge, right? And it's not that people are saying, crying out on the train stations in Hungary, that we want freedom and we want Germany. So really, this is a call for German leadership. Unfortunately, Merkel has been too always, watching behind her shoulder as to what is a domestic opinion, public opinion. Now she's won so many re-elections, she doesn't need to. And I think it's the time for her to step up one plate and to show the leadership.
Professor Chaulia, do you see this sentiment, xenophobia that Ambassador Sajanhar talked about as, one of the major obstacles to the EU coming up with any coherent policy on this issue?
Sure, yeah. Narrow political calculations will dictate that no matter what type of regime is in power, they have to pander because the fear that, you're letting in these hordes who are going to steal our jobs. So that is, most politicians, including even Merkel, has to contend with it, even though she has taken a liberal position right now. And in fact, the hypocrisy, the problem extends even beyond Europe. Like if you look at it, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, the ones that are supposedly in a coalition against ISIS, Qatar, they have taken zero, they have not taken any resettlement. So the bulk has been borne only by Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, which are the immediate neighbors of Syria. The Persian Gulf monarchies have not taken any. But on the other hand, they talk about, we have to overthrow Assad and, that's how we'll get a solution to this problem. And they have been financing these jihadist groups. So be it the absconding EU or be it the, complete hypocrisy of the Persian Gulf monarchies, it's a kind of like an abdication of responsibility collectively by all the key regional players who could matter. And the United States and Canada are far away geographically, and they are taking very few refugees anyway for resettlement. And Australia, the other big haven for refugees over the years, is again geographically far away. It's more worried about the Rohingya migrants and the boat people coming from Myanmar and Bangladesh. So here you have a situation where there is a big vacuum, And the UN is paralyzed in the sense there is a UNHCR. It's there now on the ground in many of these countries, which is directly responsible for refugee status determination and immediate material assistance and so on. But again, at the end of the day, you quoted the figure, there are 60 million displaced people around the world. The wars have peaked, the violence has come back in a big way. So it's a systemic challenge, and to think about it, the staggering proportions that we spoke about are reflective of the systemic challenge where we have not been able to construct a new world order in the post-Cold War period. And what it means is that we are unprepared for these kind of challenges. And at the level of the UN, at the level of the G20, at the level of large multilateral organizations, we have failed clearly to deal with this. The EU itself is a large multilateral organization, and it's not able to deliver. So it's a question mark actually on what kind of institutions we can create that are more humane and also practical, because we need to change the debate. We need to talk about the need for these people who are flooding in from an economic point of view. And of course, assimilation is an issue. The real issue, as colleagues have been saying, this racism or xenophobia goes back to the colonial gene. The Europeans have not been able to exorcise it completely, even though they have taken on this grand liberal project of regional integration and have been showing the way to the rest of the world. And we must always take our hats off for what they have done so far. But that, you know, the social resistance that you asked comes from the colonial gene, where there is this innate sense of superiority, that, you know, white Christian Europe should not be, you know, vitiated through the incoming influx. So I think you need generations have passed since fascism and Nazism, but nonetheless it's somewhere there, it's lurking beneath the surface, and the Europeans have to actually target that eventually if they have to overcome this problem.
So they are not displaying the liberal values on which the EU system was founded.
At the social level, there is a lot of resistance.
Freedom of movement.
In principle,
and open
the EU has a common foreign and security policy. In practice, it's not. In principle, they have had agreements. In practice, not. Why? Because, you know, in many ways, the intergovernmental processes have outrun the social mood. The social mood is still stuck in the 19th and 20th centuries, where they were the rulers of these places. Therefore, the legacy problem. Therefore, they are not acknowledging that they destabilized Libya, and therefore we are getting this influx. They are not talking about this. They are not raising these uncomfortable questions as to the root causes.
On that note, it's time for me to wrap up this discussion here. I'd like to thank all my guests for coming to the studios. It was a pleasure having you here. That's it for now in this edition of Public Forum. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.